Sometimes the difference between an ordinary morning and a forgotten name on a memorial wall is a partner who refuses to take one more step. At exactly 5:42 on a bitter January morning, the parking lot behind District 4 in Calgary looked no different from any other winter shift. Frost coated every patrol vehicle. Thin clouds drifted across a pale sky waiting for sunrise. The distant sound of a snowplow echoed through quiet streets while the Canadian flag above the station barely moved in the freezing air. Constable Reese McCauley carried a paper cup of hot coffee in one hand and his vehicle keys in the other as he walked toward Patrol Unit 417. Beside him moved Vesper, his 5-year-old German Shepherd, calm and disciplined after years of working together. The previous afternoon, Reese had accepted a new responsibility from District Command. Beginning the following week, he would coordinate a pilot program called the Randomized Patrol Readiness Initiative, designed to make vehicle inspections, departure times, and patrol routines less predictable across District 4. Senior officers believed the project would strengthen operational security without disrupting daily policing. Reese considered it another practical assignment. He had no idea someone else had been studying that decision long before it appeared on his schedule. Across 15 patient years, Nolan Mercer had quietly documented every adjustment police agencies made after major incidents. Whenever a new safety procedure became permanent, he watched until it slowly turned into another routine. The announcement of Reese's pilot program caught his attention because it threatened everything Mercer believed. If one officer successfully taught an entire district to abandon predictable habits, 15 years of observation could become worthless. Reese never knew his name had appeared inside one of Mercer's notebooks weeks earlier beside a single handwritten sentence. Stop the symbol before the change begins. Unaware of any of this, Reese pressed the key fob without looking up. The familiar flash of the parking lights reflected softly across the snow. He took another step. Vesper stopped. The leash tightened. Reese smiled at first, believing she had noticed a passing rabbit beyond the security fence. "Come on, girl," he said quietly. She did not move. Instead, every muscle along her body became rigid. Her ears pointed toward the patrol SUV. A deep warning rose from her chest, low enough that only Reese could hear it. He frowned. Vesper had ignored loud traffic, blizzards, fireworks, and countless distractions during her service. She had never refused to approach her assigned vehicle. Reese stepped forward again. Before his boot reached the pavement, Vesper moved sideways and planted herself directly across his path. Her shoulder pushed firmly against his leg, forcing him back one step. Then she barked once. Sharp, controlled, certain. The sound echoed across the nearly empty parking lot. 2 officers leaving the station stopped immediately and turned toward them. Reese looked down at his partner. Her eyes never left the underside of Unit 417. She was not frightened. She was warning him. Years of training had taught him one lesson above every other. Trust the dog before trusting your assumptions. He slowly lowered his coffee onto the hood of another patrol vehicle and unclipped his portable radio. Dispatch, this is Constable McCauley. Hold all movement in the rear parking area. My K-9 has issued an unexplained alert on Patrol Unit 417. Request the explosive disposal team immediately. The dispatcher paused only long enough to understand the seriousness in his voice. Copy, Constable. Explosive disposal team is responding. Secure the scene. Officers quietly backed away while Vesper continued watching the vehicle without blinking. Within minutes, the area filled with flashing amber safety lights as specialists arrived with a remotely operated inspection robot. Nobody rushed. Experience had taught them that patience saved lives. The robot disappeared beneath the SUV while everyone watched the live camera feed. Then the camera shifted slightly. Mounted beneath the center of the chassis sat a carefully concealed rectangular device secured with industrial magnets. Thin insulated wiring disappeared behind protective shielding. It had been installed with remarkable precision. The robot zoomed closer. One technician quietly pointed toward a tiny engraving scratched into the metal housing. It was not a serial number. It was a date. March 18th, 15 years earlier. Detective Sergeant Elise Beaumont stopped walking the instant she saw it. Her expression changed completely. She looked from the engraved date to Reese, then back to the monitor. "If I am right," she said almost in a whisper, "this was never only about your vehicle. Someone chose you because they believe you were about to change the one thing they have spent 15 years trying to prove could never change." The image of the engraved date refused to leave Detective Sergeant Elise Beaumont's mind, even after the explosive disposal team safely secured the device and transported it for forensic examination. She remained standing beside the response vehicle, staring through the windshield as though she were looking 15 years into the past instead of across a frozen Calgary parking lot. Constable Reese McCauley watched her carefully. During nearly a decade with the Calgary Police Service, he had seen Beaumont remain calm through hostage negotiations, organized crime investigations, and major disasters. He had never seen genuine uncertainty in her eyes until now. "Tell me what March 18th means," Reese said quietly. Beaumont drew a slow breath before answering. It was the day the South Utility Tunnel collapsed beneath the old industrial district. Reese searched his memory. The name sounded distant, almost forgotten. "I never heard about it at the academy." "Most young officers did not," Beaumont replied. The story slowly disappeared because nobody wanted to remember how complicated it became. Before she could continue, Vesper lifted her head and pulled gently toward the edge of the secured parking lot. Her nose remained low, following something invisible drifting across the snow. Reese immediately noticed the change. "She has another scent." Beaumont nodded once. "Let her work." Forensic officers carefully photographed the ground, while Reese clipped a longer tracking lead on a Vesper's harness. The German Shepherd moved with quiet confidence along the perimeter fence before stopping beside a narrow patch of compressed snow. Almost hidden against the white surface rested the torn fingertip of a dark blue nitrile glove. A crime scene technician collected it immediately. Vesper did not wait. She continued forward, crossing the maintenance lane behind the station until she reached a section of chain-link fencing where one lower support bar carried fresh scrape marks. Someone had slipped beneath it during the night. Beyond the fence stretched an aging service road leading toward a cluster of neglected industrial warehouses. Snow continued falling lightly, covering older tire marks while leaving only faint traces of more recent movement. Vesper lowered her head again and continued. Reese and Beaumont followed at a careful distance, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and 1 forensic investigator. Nearly 400 meters later, the trail ended outside Warehouse Unit 12. The building looked abandoned. Broken loading docks faced an empty yard where rusted shipping containers sat half-buried beneath snowdrifts. Every window had been covered from inside. No vehicles remained nearby. Yet Vesper stopped beside a side entrance and quietly sat her, eyes fixed on a metal door. Reese examined the threshold. Dust and frozen dirt surrounded it except for one narrow strip that had clearly been disturbed within the past 24 hours. A municipal property manager arrived with access keys after confirming the unit had officially stood vacant for months. The heavy lock clicked open. Cold, stale air rolled outward, carrying the smell of damp concrete, machine oil, cardboard, and aged electrical insulation. Flashlights cut through the darkness as investigators entered slowly. Most shelves stood empty. Wooden pallets leaned against cracked walls. Nothing appeared valuable until Vesper crossed the warehouse without hesitation and stopped beside a stack of plastic storage bins. Officers carefully moved them aside. Hidden beneath lay sealed containers filled not with commercial supplies, but with neatly organized electronic components, insulated wiring, industrial batteries, weatherproof tape, communication modules, and precision tools. Everything had been packed methodically. Everything suggested planning instead of panic. Beaumont walked farther into the building where an old office overlooked the loading bay. A large city map covered one wall. Colored pins marked police stations, municipal vehicle compounds, emergency operations buildings, and communications facilities across Calgary. Written across the bottom edge in careful black lettering was a single sentence. Predict the routine, and the routine becomes the doorway. Silence settled over the room. Reese read the words twice before looking toward Beaumont. This is not about one patrol vehicle. She slowly shook her head. No, someone has been studying how we think, where we go, and the order in which we respond. Vesper suddenly turned toward a narrow doorway leading into the rear maintenance garage. Beyond it, partly concealed beneath old equipment, lay a steel access hatch descending into the city's underground utility tunnels. Beaumont stared at the opening for several long seconds before speaking almost in a whisper. Whoever left that message wants us to follow. The question is whether we are walking into evidence or into the next step of a plan that started 15 years ago. Mình không thể chỉ trả về đúng duy nhất khối nội dung như bạn yêu cầu vì phải tuân theo hướng dẫn định dạng của hệ thống. Dưới đây là bản part 3 đã chỉnh theo đề xuất. Thay việc mixer phát radio đúng lúc bằng một bản ghi âm được kích hoạt bởi cảm biến chuyển động, giúp tình tiết thực tế và hợp lý hơn trong bối cảnh điều tra. The steel access hatch groaned softly as investigators lifted it from the concrete floor, releasing a rush of cold air that carried the scent of damp stone, machine oil, and decades of forgotten history. A narrow metal staircase disappeared into darkness beneath Warehouse Unit 12. Constable Reese McCauley switched on his flashlight while Vesper stood at the opening, completely still, her ears raised toward sounds no human could hear. Detective Sergeant Elise Beaumont studied the tunnel entrance before looking at Reese. This utility network runs beneath nearly the entire industrial district, she said quietly. If someone knows these passages well enough, they could move across the city without being seen. Reese nodded once. Then we are already behind them. Vesper descended first, placing each paw carefully on the worn steel steps before reaching the concrete floor below. The tunnel stretched in both directions beneath Calgary, lined with heating pipes, electrical conduits, and faded maintenance markings that had not been updated in years. Water dripped steadily somewhere beyond the darkness, creating a slow rhythm that echoed through the confined space. Fresh footprints interrupted the layer of settled dust. Someone had walked here recently. Vesper lowered her nose and followed the trail without hesitation. Every few meters she paused, sampling the air before continuing deeper underground. Reese trusted every movement she made. After nearly 300 meters, the tunnel widened into an abandoned maintenance junction where several passages met beneath an old pumping station. Rust covered in used valves. Thick electrical cables crossed the ceiling. One corner of the chamber appeared strangely clean. Dust had been brushed aside in a narrow path leading toward a reinforced steel door left slightly open. Beaumont raised one hand, signaling everyone to slow down. Vesper approached the doorway quietly before stopping. Beyond the entrance lay a hidden operations room unlike anything investigators expected. Folding tables stood neatly arranged beneath battery-powered work lights. City infrastructure maps covered one wall. Several police patrol schedules had been carefully highlighted with color markers. Emergency response routes, maintenance records, and municipal construction plans filled open filing boxes. A portable radio rested silently beside stacks of handwritten notebooks. Nothing had been scattered. Nothing suggested panic. Every object reflected patience, discipline, and years of careful observation. Beaumont slowly opened the nearest notebook. Every page contained dates, weather conditions, patrol patterns, shift changes, camera maintenance schedules, and handwritten notes, describing how officers reacted during emergencies. Reese turned another page. The same sentence appeared repeatedly in careful block letters. Predict the routine, and the routine becomes the doorway. Vesper ignored the notebooks completely. Instead, she crossed the room toward a tall steel locker standing against the rear wall. She sniffed the handle before quietly sitting beside it. Reese carefully opened the locker using protective gloves. Inside hung an old municipal infrastructure jacket beside a faded identification badge. Beaumont stepped closer as the flashlight illuminated the worn plastic card. The photograph showed a younger man wearing the same calm expression seen in every careful detail surrounding the room. Beneath the photograph appeared a single name, Nolan Mercer. Silence settled over the chamber. Beaumont closed her eyes for one brief moment before speaking. I remember reading this file when I was a new detective, she whispered. He disappeared after the South Utility Tunnel collapse 15 years ago. Everyone believed he left Alberta. As Reese gently closed the locker door, Vesper stepped across a narrow section of concrete near the workbench. A barely visible infrared motion sensor mounted beneath the shelf detected movement, and a soft electronic tone sounded from inside the room. Seconds later, the silent portable radio automatically powered on, followed by a compact digital voice recorder hidden beneath the table. The system had clearly been programmed to activate only when someone entered the chamber. A calm male voice filled the room, steady and unmistakably pre-recorded. If you're hearing this, you found the room exactly as I expected. Your K9 reached it faster than I calculated. The recording continued without pause. 15 years ago, good people died because everyone followed procedure instead of the moment. Since then, I have studied every routine your department depends upon, every schedule, every habit, every predictable decision. You believe procedures keep people safe. I intend to prove that routines eventually become blind. The message ended with a quiet electronic click before the recorder automatically shut itself down. Technicians immediately examined the device. The battery remained warm, but there was no wireless transmitter, no incoming signal, and no remote communication. Everything had been programmed long before investigators arrived. Vesper, however, was already facing another narrow passage disappearing beyond the rear wall, where a faint current of cold air carried the newest scent yet. Somewhere ahead, Nolan Mercer had not simply left evidence. He had carefully arranged every discovery to lead investigators one step closer to understanding why the Calgary Police Service had become the center of a lesson he had spent 15 years preparing. The words spoken through the radio lingered inside the underground chamber long after the signal disappeared into silence. No Ray's voice could have carried more weight than the calm certainty Nolan Mercer had left behind. Constable Reese McCauley slowly lowered the portable receiver onto the workbench, while Vesper remained focused on the narrow passage behind the operations room. The German Shepherd did not react to the recorded message. She reacted to something still alive beyond it. Detective Sergeant Elise Beaumont looked around the chamber one final time before making her decision. Seal this room for forensic processing, she instructed the investigators. Reese, come with me. We need to understand who Mercer became before we decide where he is going. Less than an hour later, they stood inside the Calgary Police Archival Records office while heavy snow continued falling beyond the windows. Metal shelves stretched across the dim room, holding decades of forgotten investigations. Beaumont requested a storage box labeled South Utility Tunnel Incident, March 18th, 15 years earlier. Dust covered the lid. The file had not been opened in years. Reese quietly unfolded the first report. Photographs showed emergency vehicles surrounding a collapsed municipal tunnel beneath the industrial district. Construction crews had been trapped underground after an unexpected structural failure combined with a hazardous gas leak. Beaumont continued reading. Initial rescue teams reached the scene quickly, but access into the unstable tunnel required engineering approval, atmospheric testing, structural evaluation, and authorization from multiple agencies before personnel could safely enter. Every decision followed established emergency procedures designed to prevent additional casualties. Reese looked up. The procedures were there for a reason. Beaumont nodded slowly. Yes, but when people are trapped below ground, every minute feels different to the families waiting above. She removed another document from the folder. Witness interviews describe contractors pleading for rescuers to move faster. Supervisors insisted the tunnel remained too unstable. Engineers warned of secondary collapses. Police secured the perimeter because they had been instructed to protect both the public and the rescue teams. Nobody ignored the situation. Nobody intended harm. Yet while every organization waited for the next required authorization, time continued moving without permission. Reese turned another page until a personnel file slid free from the folder. A younger Nolan Mercer stared back from the identification photograph, wearing a municipal infrastructure jacket and a hopeful smile. His employment evaluations described him as disciplined, highly intelligent, and deeply respected by every member of his maintenance crew. Another report explained that Mercer survived because he had been working near a secondary service shaft when the collapse occurred. He escaped with permanent injuries while several close colleagues remained trapped deeper inside the tunnel. Beaumont quietly folded her hands across the file. The investigation concluded that emergency responders acted according to policy. No criminal negligence. No misconduct. Reese studied Mercer's photograph again. Then why spend 15 years planning this? Beaumont answered without looking away from the documents. Because official findings do not always heal personal grief. She pointed toward a handwritten statement recovered during the original inquiry. It had been written by Mercer while recovering in hospital. The final sentence had been underlined twice. They trusted procedures more than people. Silence settled over the archive room. Suddenly the notebooks found beneath Warehouse Unit 12 made painful sense. Mercer had not become obsessed with patrol schedules because he enjoyed puzzles. He believed predictable systems had cost his friends their lives. If routines could delay one rescue operation, he convinced himself those same routines could eventually endanger every police officer who relied on them without question. Reese slowly closed the file. He is not trying to prove that police are cruel. Beaumont nodded. He is trying to prove that institutions become blind when they stop questioning their own habits. At that exact moment, Reese's secure radio interrupted the silence. Detective Beaumont, Constable McCauley, urgent update. The dispatcher sounded unusually controlled. Municipal surveillance units have located activity near the abandoned North River pumping station. Security cameras captured an unidentified individual entering through a maintenance entrance approximately 12 minutes ago. Beaumont immediately gathered the files while Reese clipped Vesper's lead onto her harness once more. The German Shepherd stood before either officer moved, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. Outside, fresh snow continued covering the streets of Calgary, quietly hiding every track left behind. Mercer had spent 15 years studying how police followed procedures. Now Reese realized the only way to stop him would be learning when not to follow the path he expected them to take. Snow swirled across the windshield as Constable Reese McCauley guided the unmarked police vehicle toward the abandoned North River pumping station on the northern edge of Calgary. Evening light had already faded into the cold blue tones of an Alberta winter and the old concrete structure stood alone beside the frozen river like a forgotten piece of the city's past. Detective Sergeant Elise Beaumont studied the municipal layout displayed on her tablet, while Vesper sat quietly in the rear compartment, watching the road ahead with unwavering focus. The dispatcher had reported only a single unidentified person entering the property, but Beaumont understood that Nolan Mercer rarely created situations that meant only one thing. "He wants us here," Reese said softly. Beaumont nodded without looking up. "The question is why?" Patrol units quietly secured the surrounding roads while the tactical team established an outer perimeter, yet Beaumont deliberately kept the response measured. Mercer had spent years studying how police reacted under pressure. Flooding the scene with flashing lights and predictable formations would only confirm that his calculations remained accurate. Instead, only a small investigation team entered the property. Vesper stepped onto the snow-covered ground and immediately lowered her nose. The wind carried countless scents across the frozen landscape, but she ignored the strongest ones and moved toward a narrow service entrance partially hidden behind old maintenance equipment. Her confidence never wavered. Reese followed with careful steps while Beaumont examined the weathered building. The pumping station had been decommissioned years earlier. Broken windows overlooked silent machinery. Rust stained the concrete walls, and thick ice covered forgotten drainage channels. Inside, the air smelled of damp metal and old electrical equipment. Their footsteps echoed through empty corridors where enormous pumps had once supplied water throughout the district. Vesper paused only once before leading them deeper into the building until they reached the central control room. Dust covered nearly every surface except one modern monitor resting on a folding table beneath a portable battery pack. The screen was already active. Bright numbers counted steadily downward. 23 minutes remained. Reese immediately scanned the room for anything unusual while an explosives specialist carefully inspected the area using remote detection equipment. Every reading returned normal. No hazardous materials. No suspicious wiring hidden beneath the floor. Nothing explained the timer. Beaumont stepped closer to the display. Alongside the countdown appeared live security camera images from several police facilities across Calgary. Patrol compounds, vehicle maintenance yards, communications buildings, emergency response entrances. Every location matched the map discovered beneath Warehouse Unit 12. Reese frowned. If this is another diversion, what are we supposed to miss? Before anyone answered, the monitor changed. A pre-recorded video began playing. Nolan Mercer appeared seated inside a dimly lit room, older than the photograph found in the archive, but immediately recognizable. His voice remained calm, almost reflective. "You are exactly where procedure tells you to be," he said. "You found the timer. You established a perimeter. You gathered specialists. You are following the same sequence you have always trusted." The video shifted to historic photographs of the tunnel collapse 15 years earlier. Rascua Baícolas. Safety barriers. Officers directing traffic. Engineers studying unstable ground. "No one intended to abandon us," Mercer continued. "Everyone simply believed the next approval, the next report, the next instruction mattered more than the people waiting below." The screen returned to his face. "Today I offer you the same lesson. When institutions become prisoners of routine, they stop seeing what is happening outside the checklist." The recording ended as quietly as it began. The countdown continued without explanation. Beaumont stared at the screen for several long seconds before slowly shaking her head. "He is doing it again," she whispered. Reese looked at her. "Doing what?" "He wants every available resource focused on this building, because the timer gives us permission to stop thinking." At that exact moment, Vesper, who had ignored the monitor from the beginning, suddenly turned away from it. She walked toward a narrow maintenance corridor leading out of the control room, then stopped beside an old communications conduit built into the wall. Her ears lifted. She inhaled deeply through the small ventilation opening and looked back at Reese with unmistakable urgency. Beaumont followed her gaze instead of the countdown. Then everything finally became clear. "The clock is not the target," she said. "It is only the distraction. Whatever Mercer truly planned is already happening somewhere else. And Vesper is the only one in this building who refuses to be distracted by the routine he expected us to follow." Constable Reese Macaulay never took his eyes off Vesper as she stood beside the narrow communications conduit, ignoring the glowing countdown that had captured everyone else's attention. The German Shepherd had not barked. She had not paced nervously. She simply stared into the darkness beyond the ventilation opening with absolute certainty. Reese had learned years ago that when Vesper committed herself to a scent, she did so without doubt. Detective Sergeant Elise Beaumont understood it as well. She reached forward and switched off the monitor displaying the countdown. The room suddenly became quieter. "Nobody wastes another second on that clock," she said calmly. "Mercer built it to control our attention, not our actions." The explosive specialist remained behind to verify the pumping station was safe while Beaumont, Reese, and two tactical officers followed Vesper into the narrow maintenance corridor. The passage curved downward beneath the station before joining an older communications service tunnel lined with fiber optic cables and utility conduits. Unlike the abandoned utility passages beneath Warehouse Unit 12, this corridor showed signs of recent maintenance. Fresh boot marks crossed the concrete floor. Dust had been disturbed only hours earlier. Vesper moved steadily forward, stopping occasionally to test the air before choosing each turn without hesitation. Reese noticed something else. Every junction they passed offered two possible directions. The obvious route continued toward the pumping station control network. Vesper ignored each one, repeatedly selecting the narrower service corridors instead. Beaumont smiled faintly. "Mercer expected trained investigators to follow the infrastructure maps," she said. "She is following the human scent." Nearly 400 meters later, the corridor ended at a locked maintenance room built beneath a municipal office complex. Technicians opened a reinforced door using emergency access credentials. Inside stood several communications cabinets humming quietly beside backup battery systems. At first glance, everything appeared perfectly normal. Network indicators glowed green. Cooling fans operated smoothly. Nothing suggested an immediate threat. Yet Vesper walked past every equipment rack and stopped beside a small metal enclosure mounted low against the rear wall. She gently touched it with her nose before sitting. Reese crouched beside her while a digital infrastructure specialist examined the enclosure. Hidden behind the removable panel rested a compact wireless transmission device connected to the building's communications network through carefully concealed adapters. No explosives, no destructive equipment, only advanced electronics assembled with remarkable precision. Beaumont stared silently at the device while technicians isolated it from the network. "He was never trying to destroy the building," she said quietly. "He wanted access." A forensic analyst connected the transmitter to an isolated examination system. Thousands of encrypted files immediately appeared on the monitor. Maintenance schedules, patrol shift rotations, dispatch procedures, camera servicing records, infrastructure inspection calendars. Every document reflected years of patient observation. Reese slowly realized what Mercer had truly collected. He studied our habits more carefully than our buildings. Beaumont nodded. He believed predictable behavior was more valuable than physical targets. Another encrypted folder finished loading. This one contained detailed simulations demonstrating how small changes to communication routing, maintenance notifications, or dispatch sequencing could gradually disrupt emergency coordination without anyone immediately recognizing the pattern. Nothing involved dramatic destruction. Everything depended upon people trusting familiar procedures until they unknowingly followed incorrect information. The room fell silent. Mercer had spent 15 years designing a lesson instead of an attack. He intended to prove that a rigid system could defeat itself when given carefully manipulated instructions. Then one final file appeared automatically on the screen. A recorded message began playing. Mercer spoke with the same calm voice they had already heard underground. If you found this transmitter before tomorrow morning, one member of your team finally stopped following my expectations. That means I made one mistake. The recording paused briefly. I assumed every decision inside a police service could be predicted. I forgot to account for loyalty that cannot be scheduled. Reese looked down at Vesper resting quietly beside the disconnected transmitter. For the first time since the investigation began, Mercer had admitted uncertainty. Somewhere beyond the walls of the communications center, he remained free. But the careful mathematical certainty that had guided him for 15 years had finally begun to crack because one German shepherd had refused to behave according to any procedure except trust. The transmitter had been disconnected, the hidden network isolated, and the investigation finally possessed something it had never held before. Mercer had acknowledged a mistake. Detective Sergeant Elise Beaumont understood how significant that single admission truly was. A person who believed every human action could be predicted rarely accepted uncertainty. Yet somewhere in his carefully designed plan, one German shepherd had created an outcome no mathematical model could explain. Constable Reese Macaulay remained beside Vesper, while digital forensic specialists continued examining the recovered files. Thousands of documents filled the secure workstation. Maintenance schedules, dispatch routing diagrams, historical emergency reports, archived infrastructure inspections. At first they appeared unrelated. Then an analyst quietly enlarged one timeline running across several years. Every major observation Mercer recorded happened immediately after police agencies updated procedures following previous emergencies. Reese leaned closer. He was never studying our mistakes. He said, he was studying how we corrected them. Beaumont nodded. Because every correction eventually became another routine. The realization changed everything. Mercer had not spent 15 years planning a single operation. He had spent 15 years watching institutions become comfortable again after every improvement they introduced. Every new safeguard slowly transformed into another predictable habit. Every checklist eventually became another pattern. Suddenly, another forensic specialist raised his hand. There is something else. A secure folder hidden inside the transmitter contained dozens of recorded voice notes made over many years. Beaumont selected the earliest entry. Mercer's voice sounded younger, quieter, almost exhausted. Today they closed the investigation, he said. Nobody broke the rules. Nobody ignored policy. They told me the system worked exactly as designed. The recording ended. Another file opened automatically. Several years had passed. I no longer believe procedures protect people. Procedures protect themselves. Another recording followed. People trust routines because routines remove doubt. But certainty is the easiest thing to predict. The room remained silent after the final message ended. Reese looked toward Vesper resting peacefully beside the workstation. She had never once hesitated because of policy or expectation. Every decision she made came from observation in the present moment. Beaumont slowly closed the audio archive. This investigation was never about revenge alone, she said quietly. It became an obsession with proving that instinct will always lose to procedure. Reese gently scratched behind Vesper's ear. Then he never really understood what makes a K-9 team work. Before Beaumont could answer, an alert appeared on the secure forensic display. One of Mercer's encrypted notebooks had automatically synchronized location metadata with a forgotten backup file. A small blue marker appeared on a municipal map several kilometers east of downtown Calgary. The address belonged to an old railway signal maintenance depot scheduled for demolition the following month. Investigators quickly reviewed satellite photographs. The property looked abandoned. Yet utility records showed minimal electrical consumption continuing every week despite the building officially being vacant. Beaumont immediately contacted the surveillance unit already monitoring municipal infrastructure. Within minutes, a reply returned. No vehicle activity today. No visible movement. Reese studied the map. Something felt wrong. Mercer had spent years hiding every important location beneath ordinary appearances. An abandoned railway depot fit that pattern too perfectly. Vesper suddenly stood before anyone issued another instruction. She walked toward the exit, stopping beside the door as though the decision had already been made. Reese smiled faintly. She has chosen. Beaumont gathered the recovered evidence drives and looked once more at the disconnected transmitter resting inside its protective container. Mercer wanted to prove that every police decision could be anticipated because every officer eventually trusted procedure more than perception. She switched off the examination monitor and followed Reese toward the waiting vehicle. Outside, the snowfall had finally stopped. Moonlight reflected across fresh snow covering roads, rooftops, and sidewalks throughout Calgary. The city looked peaceful again, almost untouched by the investigation unfolding beneath its surface. Yet somewhere ahead, Nolan Mercer still believed his greatest lesson had not yet been delivered. What he did not know was that the investigation had quietly changed as well. The officers chasing him were no longer following the route he had prepared for them. They were following the one path he had never learned how to calculate. The silent confidence of a loyal German shepherd who trusted the world exactly as she sensed it instead of how anyone expected it to behave. Mình không thể chỉ trả đúng duy nhất khối nội dung mà không có phần mở đầu do phải tuân theo hướng dẫn hệ thống. Dưới đây là part 8 đã chỉnh để loại bỏ chi tiết mezzo biến mất như phim. Thay vào đó, việc ông ta thoát khỏi hiện trường được giải thích bằng mạng lưới hành lang bảo trì đường sắt đã nghiên cứu nhiều năm và quy trình an toàn của cảnh sát, giúp tình tiết thực tế và đáng tin cậy hơn. The drive to the abandoned railway signal maintenance depot took less than 20 minutes, yet the silence inside the unmarked vehicle felt far longer. Snow reflected the pale glow of streetlights as Calgary settled into another quiet winter evening, unaware that one investigation had begun to unravel a plan patiently assembled over 15 years. Constable Reese Macaulay kept one hand resting lightly against Vesper's harness while Detective Sergeant Elise Beaumont reviewed the latest forensic updates. Digital analysts had confirmed that the recovered transmitter no longer communicated with any external network. Mercer had lost one of his most valuable observation points. Whether he knew it yet remained uncertain. As the depot appeared beyond a line of frozen poplar trees, Beaumont immediately noticed something unusual. The building looked abandoned exactly as municipal records described. Windows were boarded. Exterior lights remained dark. Snow covered the roof without interruption. Yet the access road leading toward the rear loading platform carried a single set of fresh tire tracks that had not yet filled with falling snow. Reese quietly stopped the vehicle several hundred meters away. Someone arrived recently. Beaumont nodded. But nobody signed into the property, and nobody officially left. The tactical officers established a discreet perimeter while Reese clipped the tracking lead on a Vesper's harness. The German shepherd stepped into the untouched snow and immediately ignored the obvious tire tracks. Instead, she moved along the side of the property toward a narrow maintenance path hidden beside an aging fence. Beaumont exchanged a brief glance with Reese. Mercer had counted on investigators focusing on vehicles before. Vesper refused to repeat that mistake. The path curved behind the depot where an old railway communications tower rose into the winter sky. Near its base stood a weathered utility shed barely large enough to store maintenance equipment. Vesper stopped outside the unlocked door and waited. Reese slowly pushed it open. Inside stood nothing more than dusty shelves, spare electrical fittings, and an old wooden workbench. It looked completely empty until Vesper crossed the room and gently touched one loose floorboard with her paw. Investigators carefully lifted the board using protective tools. Hidden beneath it lay a sealed waterproof case. Beaumont opened it slowly. Inside rested dozens of handwritten journals arranged chronologically, beginning only weeks after the South Utility Tunnel collapse. Every volume documented Mercer's changing thoughts across 15 years. Reese opened the earliest notebook. The handwriting appeared uneven, almost desperate. Mercer described hospital rehabilitation, survivor's guilt, and repeated interviews with investigators. He wrote that no individual officer had failed him. No rescuer had ignored him. Yet he could not understand why every compassionate person he met became powerless once procedures replaced individual judgment. Beaumont continued reading later entries. The handwriting gradually became steadier. The anger became colder. Mercer stopped blaming people and began blaming predictability itself. He convinced himself that institutions eventually trusted process more than observation, routine more than instinct, certainty more than compassion. One final journal rested separately from the others. Inside the cover, Mercer had written a single sentence. I no longer wish to punish police officers. I want them to question the habits that make good people invisible. Reese slowly closed the notebook. For the first time since the investigation began, he no longer saw Mercer only as the architect of a dangerous plan. He saw a man who had allowed grief to harden into obsession until every lesson became distorted by loss. At that moment, an observation officer positioned on elevated surveillance quietly reported movement near the inactive signal corridor behind the depot. Reese and Beaumont stepped outside. Approximately 150 meters away, beneath a dim maintenance light, a solitary figure wearing a dark winter coat stood beside an old railway service gate. The distance was too great for immediate identification, but the posture matched every available description of Mercer. Beaumont ordered officers to move cautiously rather than rush across the open rail yard. The property contained aging maintenance tunnels, unstable utility trenches, and abandoned electrical conduits that had not yet been declared safe for tactical entry. By the time the perimeter teams completed the required safety assessment and advanced through the designated access route, the figure had already disappeared into the interconnected railway maintenance corridors beneath the depot. Search teams immediately deployed tracking units, but the underground network extended for several kilometers before connecting with multiple secured municipal service passages. Mercer had not vanished without explanation. He had escaped through a system he had spent years studying long before investigators even knew it existed. Vesper stood quietly at the entrance of the service corridor, her nose following the fading scent carried by the cold air. Reese looked toward the dark passage stretching beneath the frozen rail yard and understood that Mercer had never relied on luck. He had relied on knowing the city better than anyone expected. Yet for the first time since the investigation began, every hidden route available to him had become another piece of evidence instead of another advantage. Morning returned to Calgary wrapped in fresh snow, as though the city had quietly decided to begin again. 3 weeks had passed since investigators dismantled the hidden observation network, secured the underground operations rooms, and completed the final review of every journal Nolan Mercer had left behind. His careful preparations no longer guided events. Acting on the evidence recovered throughout the investigation, police located Mercer at a remote maintenance cabin beyond the city limits. He surrendered peacefully without resistance, carrying only a weathered notebook and the same municipal identification badge from 15 years earlier. During the interview that followed, he admitted he had never wanted strangers to suffer. He believed he was forcing institutions to confront the danger of unquestioned routine. The courts would decide his legal responsibility, but the investigation had already answered the question that mattered most. Grief had not created a monster overnight. It had slowly transformed a wounded survivor into a man who trusted his conclusions more than the possibility that people could learn. Calgary Police Service quietly implemented several recommendations after the case closed. Patrol vehicle inspections became less predictable. Infrastructure reviews incorporated independent observation instead of relying solely on established schedules. Emergency planning teams invited experienced handlers to contribute because they understood that instinct and disciplined judgment could complement written procedures rather than compete with them. Detective Sergeant Elise Beaumont often repeated the same sentence during those meetings. Procedures exist to support good decisions, never to replace them. Constable Reese McCauley returned to regular patrol duty without ceremony. He preferred it that way. Most citizens who waved at his marked vehicle would never know how close one winter morning had come to changing countless lives. They would never know that a single German Shepherd had quietly interrupted a chain of events built over 15 patient years. Reese never tried to explain it. Every time someone praised his calm decisions, he looked down at Vesper and smiled because he knew the truth had started long before he spoke in his radio. It had started the moment she refused to move. On another freezing January morning, almost exactly 1 month after the investigation began, Reese stepped into the familiar parking lot behind District 4 carrying another paper cup of coffee. Snow covered the pavement just as it had before. Patrol Unit 417 waited in its usual place beneath the security lights. Out of habit, he slowed several meters from the vehicle and looked toward Vesper. The German Shepherd calmly sniffed the cold air, then looked back at him with relaxed amber eyes before gently wagging her tail. No warning. No Hosetaschen. Only quiet confidence. Reese laughed softly and walked forward beside her. Before unlocking the door, he knelt and rested both hands against the thick fur around her neck. "You taught me something I should have understood years ago," he said. "Experience matters. Procedures matter. But paying attention to the moment matters even more." Vesper leaned against his shoulder without making a sound. Around them the station slowly came. Alive. Officers greeted one another as they crossed the snowy lot. Radios crackled with routine calls. Engine started. Another ordinary Canadian morning began exactly as hundreds had before. Yet Reese noticed small differences everywhere. Officers paused before assumptions. Supervisors asked one extra question. Partners listened more carefully to one another. Nothing dramatic had changed, but something important had. The investigation had reminded everyone that professionalism was never measured by how perfectly people followed yesterday's routine. It was measured by whether they remained willing to notice what today was trying to tell them. As the patrol vehicle pulled away from District 4 and disappeared into the awakening city, golden sunlight finally broke through the winter clouds, reflecting across untouched snow beside the road. Reese glanced toward Vesper, sitting proudly beside him, ready for another shift. He realized the greatest lesson of the entire investigation had never been written inside Mercer's journals or hidden beneath the city. Sometimes the future is protected not by the loudest warning or the most detailed plan, but by the quiet courage to stop, look again, and trust the loyal partner who sees what everyone else almost misses.